Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Transform Corporate Culture During and Beyond COVID-19. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And with that, I will turn it over to today's moderator, Elaine Ervin, Partner and National Practice Leader for Construction at Moss Adams. Elaine, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. Once again, I am Elaine Ervin. I'm the Construction National Practice Leader for the firm. You know, with the onset of the pandemic, we've all been affected by so many changes. But the one we're going to be talking about today is the challenge with our work environment and the changes within our work environment. We've all seen the need to work remotely, and especially all the changes on the job site from an operational perspective, from a safety perspective, that has created issues within businesses, but really the importance of corporate culture has continued to be a very important topic, but maintaining that corporate culture becomes more and more challenging, which is going to be discussed today by our presenters. So joining me today is Christian Geismann. He's the CFO for Schuchart. Schuchart is a mid-sized general contractor based in the Puget Sound region. And like many companies, Schuchart has experienced significant disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and has had to adapt how it operates in response. This includes seeking to maintain its corporate culture despite the new challenges. In addition to Christian is Mark Steranka. I've had the pleasure of working with Mark for many years. He's a partner within our consulting group and has over 30 years of experience working with businesses. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to begin today's program. So thank you, Mark. It's all up to you.
Thanks, Elaine. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. We have people from across the country, from Florida to Washington, joining us on this webinar, so thanks so much for taking the time. We're excited to talk to you about this topic, which is affecting all of us. So, learning objectives. So what are we going to try to accomplish here? Well, 3 kind of primary things. First is just how does corporate culture impact our organization, and how has this very different operating environment impacted it? How do we respond to it? What are others doing? What can we learn from their successes, their challenges?
In addition to that, Good morning, everybody. This is Geismann. We will talk about new ways to address your people challenges. Ensure that those challenges are being understood and you're aware of them, and then you're designing a plan to address those challenges.
Yeah, and what we've seen. So what Christian has experienced in his firm, what we've seen across other firms, construction industry, and the various other types of organizations we work with, because we are certainly all in this together. None of us have probably gone unscathed in this process, this crazy environment. So we're going to really talk about three sort of primary facets of this topic. One is just market factors. So what is influencing corporate culture? We're certainly going to have a COVID-19 related spin to that. How we should be thinking about corporate culture differently, both in a COVID and non-COVID environment. And then, like we said, strategy. So what are we seeing that's worked? What are we experimenting with? What are the pros and cons of some of those different strategies? Before we actually get started, I thought, what is the definition of corporate culture? And it was actually in a video call yesterday on this topic, so I thought, well, I'll look it up. So according to Investopedia, corporate cultures are the beliefs and behaviors that determine how a company's employees interact and conduct business. So I think that makes intuitive sense. I think how I would summarize that is, what's your DNA? What's the DNA of your organization? That kind of embodies your corporate culture. And so that's what we're going to talk about. How do we have a positive impact on achieving and sustaining a positive DNA or positive corporate culture? And I think that leads us to our first of 4 polling questions. So Emily, over to you.
Thank you. Our first question, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the largest concern, how concerned are you about the impacts of COVID-19 on your corporate culture? And your options are 1, not concerned at all, 2, somewhat unconcerned, 3, neutral, 4, somewhat concerned, or 5, very concerned. And I'll give everyone a few moments to respond. To participate in our polls today, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. I'll give everyone a couple more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you.
Okay, great. So what we would somewhat hope to see, not that we want a negative, but somewhat concerned. So that's actually good, right? If you had everyone had said not concerned, I might have said that while you're on this webinar. But it's great that you're in general not too overly concerned, and that which probably means that you're already doing things about it and already recognizing that it has impacted. So maybe this is hopefully just an opportunity to learn again what some other organizations are doing to gain some of those ideas and insights. So thank you for that. So market factors. So we're really going to talk about 3 market factors that have an impact on corporate culture, just how our organizations function and operate, which is again in essence our corporate culture. So the first is population demographics. So regardless of what's happening in the marketplace, population demographics is affecting all of our organizations. Employee engagement, similarly, is that now an environment like a COVID environment, that's going to have different impacts on employee engagement. But regardless of that, employee engagement is going to be one of the key drivers of our corporate culture. How engaged are they in what we're trying to accomplish? And then we've got this little thing, COVID-19, that's come around and, at least for a period, turned our organizations upside down. Hopefully we're sort of right side up now, but I'm still, of course, dealing with it. And of course, there's still plenty of unknowns ahead. So first, corporate population demographics. So we've all seen charts like this. We've all heard about the impacts of baby boomers. But what does that really mean in terms of corporate culture employee engagement, how our organizations function. And relative to corporate culture, that the primary thing is every day we're losing about 11,000 baby boomers from the marketplace to retirement. And with them, typically, not for all, but typically you're losing institutional knowledge. In a lot of cases, you're losing people who have been, truly part of the DNA of the organization, perhaps for, decades. And so how do you deal with that loss of key individuals? Well, one of the challenges in that is not only them, quote unquote, going out the door, that's then who comes in behind them. So one of the challenges we see here is with the next generation, Generation X, there are fewer of those than the baby boomers going out the door. And so how do we deal with that in terms of that knowledge transfer and that retention or maintaining of corporate culture? And then if we add to that, okay, well, there are fewer Generation X, so how do we, there's going to be a gap there just in terms of resources, then in essence, theoretically, you're kind of dipping down to Generation Y, which in general are the baby boomers' kids. And so now you have an age gap. And so that's an age gap that influences us, all of our organizations, in terms of their level of experience and what it takes to get them up to the level we need to operate, especially when they're, filling in for someone who's leaving the organization, who's had more experience, but also just a different frame of mind, different approach to business, different things that are important to them. And that affects, of course, corporate culture, because think of the classic, maybe you have a more seasoned person who's nearing retirement, a younger person who's sort of their next in line, and you really get to get those two working together. And sometimes they may be very like-minded, and sometimes it may be a very different mind. And how do you get that working together, let alone throw again a COVID environment to that scenario? So employee engagement, I think this is one of the biggest, hopefully, takeaways for you in terms of how it impacts your organization as a whole, and certainly corporate culture. So Gallup poll, we've all heard of Gallup poll. They do an annual survey. They've been doing it since 2000. It's of about 100,000 workers ages 18 more across the country. And they're basically just serving one specific thing, the level of employee engagement. I came across this for the first time, actually, coincidentally. I was speaking at the CFMA conference in whatever state we were in at the time. It was in 2013, and I happened to stumble upon the survey results for that year. I was astounded by the results, and we've used this really as a driver of how we speak with and work with organizations since then. So the bottom line here is over the past 20 years, employee engagement has averaged about 30%, meaning 30% of employees are engaged. And that breaks down to about 50% not engaged and 20% what they call actively disengaged, meaning actively sort of working against the organization. They don't want to be there, they're not happy there, and they're expressing that in various ways. So just think about that for a second. Let's just call that a third. If only a third of your organization is truly engaged in what they're doing, there's no way that you're, quote unquote, firing on all cylinders, being the best that your organization can be. So that's quite alarming. On the flip side, what an enormous opportunity for improvement, and we don't think that difficult to improve. But so again, let's just think of employee engagement in terms of corporate culture. If our employees are engaged in what they're doing, they're not going to be positively contributing to corporate culture. So those two things are in a way almost synonymous. And just to show you what the progression has been over the years, actually last year they had a lot of announcements about it. Wow, we hit our all-time high of 35% engaged. Like, okay, that's nothing to get super excited about. It is a gradual improvement, so the trend line is promising. But again, in essence, what a dismal number if only 35% of our employees are engaged in what they're doing. And again, on the flip side, what an enormous opportunity to improve our organizations. So
Mark,
with that,
I'll add
that leads
before
us
we go
to
into the polling.
Sure.
Before
Yes,
we go
thanks.
into the polling question, I want to add something. So there's another study that has recently come out from a firm called Gartner, and it really hits home, why is this engagement so low, right? And why are there so many employees who are actively disengaged? And what this study found is that there are so many employees who become disillusioned because they see their leaders saying one set of behaviors, right? That the company believes in this or the company values that, but they live by another. The results actually showed that 90% say that their leaders don't behave in ways that align with the values. That's a huge percentage, 90%. And so what you could take away from that as it relates to engagement is, if there's some natural tensions, first of all, probably being aware of what those tensions are, right, that lead to this disengagement, and then trying to address them, trying to ensure that you can close the gap and try to figure out a way to better live by the values that are being espoused by that company. That's all, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank
Mark,
you.
Go
Mark,
ahead. If I could just interrupt for one moment. There was a question, and it was basically asking, do you have any insight as to how culture/engagement has been impacted by, businesses working remotely, especially for the foreseeable future? So when you're looking at this graph, any insight?
Yes, so that's a great question. Yes, we do. We're actually going to touch on that as we get into some strategies and seeing what the marketplace has been saying. So what we'll share, for example, is both in national surveys and even surveys at the company level, what they're hearing back from their employees in terms of corporate culture and the impact. And so, yes, we will actually directly address that. And of course, intuitively, there has to be impact on corporate culture of everyone working remotely. You couldn't not be impacted by that. So, yes, we in a few slides we'll address that. So, thank you. I think Emily, over to you for polling question number 2.
All right, thank you. Our second polling question: has your company conducted an employee engagement survey in the last 3 years? And your options are A, yes, B, no, or C, I don't know. And as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. We'll give everyone another moment or two here. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you.
Great, thanks, Emily. Engagement survey. Yes, so actually, that's I'll say in a way surprisingly good response. So that's excellent that you're surveying. I can say one of the things we do, we sort of annually or biannually have a significant engagement survey, but we have started doing, and we see organizations doing, sort of micro surveys, so just small focus surveys, and this is a great time to do it. Again, back to the question about impacts on corporate culture, reaching out and surveying your employees about how they're doing, asking them questions, maybe not directly towards corporate culture, but things that surround it, how their productivity, their work environment, their level of satisfaction, their stresses, their challenges. So that's great. That's great that that amount of organizations have been reaching out recently, and hopefully even more recent than the last 3 years. So the third market factor, COVID impacts. So that's part of the reason why we're here today. So these are kind of, I'll say, surface level impacts that we're sort of all aware of, and of course going to have some variation across organizations. In the construction industry, essential service, so you're going to have, in some cases, people working, sort of set aside the on-site part, but sort of an office equivalent where others are not. But what we're seeing, okay, 0 to 100% of employees working from home. I'd say the vast majority of organizations are closer to 100% than the 0% for sure. The work with limited no in-person interaction, again, set aside, and one of the real benefits of the construction industry is you are getting that in-person interaction on the job sites, which many other organizations aren't getting the benefit of. And so in part here, we'll sort of think of, okay, what about the office environment portion of your organization? Obviously, we're all relying more heavily on technology. That's a given, but I think we tend to think more about this type of technology, what we're using to communicate and interact with each other, versus how do we need to use technology to actually support workflow and processes in a more remote environment than we're used to. And then, of course, the impacts of the reduced workforce, whether it's you've reduced at all, whether you've permanently reduced, whether you've temporarily reduced. But again, all of these things, of course, impact corporate culture, impact how we're feeling about our organization. Christian, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, and a lot of this is where we're looking back to when the pandemic, first started, right? And all of the changes that have affected us, well, really affected us when things were really hitting hot and heavy, and there's so much uncertainty, right? Well, since then, yes, we are still within the midst of a pandemic, but we've been able to manage our businesses accordingly, right? With kind of this new reality. I think what we also need to make sure that we're considering is looking forward. And the benefit of the last few months has been that at least here in the Northwest, right, the weather has been good, right? Kids have been out of school just as you typically would expect them to be. But now you've got some dark skies literally approaching, right? Dark days. So that takes a toll just naturally on people. And then they're going to be at home. They're going to be lonely. And kids are home. They're not going to have in-person learning. And so the child care factor is going to be there. These are the sorts of impacts. These are the challenges looking forward, which, I talked with another company, another CFO, and they said that their senior leadership team is actively discussing what to expect on the other side in entering the fall and the winter as this just continues to prolong, and people are kind of thinking, wow, when do we get back to normal? When do we get to be together again?
Yes, lots to consider, and that certainly not a static environment. So speaking of those, what does that at-home work environment look like? Let's go to our third polling question and just get a sense of, so again, for the audience, think of your non-job site personnel, so personnel who are typically in the office relative to this. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you. Our third question, what percentage of your employees who typically work in the office at least part-time are working from home? And your options are A, 0 to 20%, B, 21 to 40%, C, 41 to 60%, D, 61 to 80%, and E, 81 to 100%. I'll give everyone a moment here. And for those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says Slide Deck and Handouts to the right of the slide view. We will also be sending the slides via email after the webcast. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you.
So these results are not surprising. Majority working from home, right? And really the extreme majority, 80 to 100%, with office employees working from home. And that's similar to what we've experienced at Schuchart. We've got approximately about 80% of our office employees working from home. We've given everybody the option. Our offices are open. We've given everybody the option to work from home or the office, but we're giving them flexibility depending upon their schedule, depending upon their comfort level, right? As I'm sure all of you are as well.
Great, and I can say for us, we're pretty much 100% working from home. So we're at that extreme end. So things have changed, and so first we're going to address sort of the impact. So the question that was submitted in terms of impact on corporate culture, and then how might you be thinking differently, or what things are you thinking about to respond? So here are results from both national and company-specific surveys. They were very, very consistent and some I think very obvious or intuitive, and some maybe not what you would have typically expected, although it makes sense. So cultural challenges. So this was one of the top things mentioned in surveys, that employees were struggling sort of with connectivity, with feeling like the culture was being maintained because they were feeling separated, isolated, right? Working from home, not having that in-person interaction. So that was specifically identified as one of the challenges employees are experiencing. One of the most interesting ones that was mentioned was productivity, and then in some cases gains and losses, and how that generally broke out was that more experienced, and I'll just say, we'll just use the word older folks, were generally expressing productivity gains, and the younger employees were generally expressing productivity losses. And so, well, why would that be? And a lot of it was because they're all working from home, or in general, the majority of them are working from home and having generally different work environments at home. So where the older workers generally were in homes, maybe had dedicated workspace within the home, maybe don't have younger kids at home that are, they have to deal with, or interrupting things, or, just having to interact with. And of course you want to do that, but things to distract and take up time, versus younger employees who may not be in homes. They may be in apartments. They may have two people working, quote unquote, from home, let's say in an apartment, and you don't have dedicated workspace. I have specific experiences of those of folks I know, and or have young kids at home. And so finding that juggling of trying to truly, literally balance work and life right at home, and finding that more difficult. So that intuitively makes sense. I think one other layer to that is maybe the folks who are generally more experienced, or just better able to adapt's not the right word, but to continue to work the way they worked, because maybe it's more ingrained how they do things, or more disciplined, just because they have more experience in doing what they do. But the productivity gains and losses, and maybe the one other thing that factored in there is, that's also an interesting phenomenon, is especially for people who travel for work, or just think of commuting, well, you get the benefit of the gain of not spending that time traveling or commuting if you're working at home. And boy, shouldn't that be a productivity gain. But I can't tell you how many times we've been on client calls where the conversation is, it seems like today all we do is we're on video calls all day. And that didn't used to be the case, of course, or being necessarily in meetings all day. So how did we go from not being in quite as many meetings as we are to even more so, and that has taken up some of that time that we could have gained. Reluctance to return to work. So this is the safety component. Lots of employees aren't comfortable about going back to work yet. So that's a strain on the organization, strain on corporate culture. Potential for suburban migration, it's actually already happening. So what does that do to commutes, which affects recruiting, retention, culture in terms of people when they get to work, how fresh they are when they get to work. Do you need to have offices at different locations because of this over time? And then just the overall societal stresses, politics, COVID impact on our families and friends from a medical standpoint, unrest in cities. All of these create stress, and stress on individuals impacts corporate culture because they're coming at things from a different frame of mind. Christian, any you want to add there?
Yeah, Mark, you know, so us as a general contractor, we've got a significant group of our employees that work in the field, right? And they don't have the option to work from home. They're either on the job site or they're sitting at home, not really able to do much. And so, you know, early on in this, especially after the shutdown occurred here in Washington State, you know, there were a lot of concerns from our field about returning to work. And, you know, there's really, like I said, there's really not too much option, right? They're either working on site or they're not working at all. And so it was important, this is just an example, right, to make sure that employee concerns are being addressed as it relates to safety. And we, you know, did our best to do this, make sure that the right safety protocols were in place, ensuring that, you know, there's adjustments being made for those who have, you know, to schedules or however you might think of it, for those who are kind of more vulnerable. So for older folks or for people that are more susceptible to, you know, getting sick, or if they get sick, it becomes worse. Point being, this reluctance to return, you know, is such a big one, and we have to consider as contractors that there's just still safety issues for people who don't have that option to work from home. Back to you, Mark.
Yep, that's right. So you've got folks who don't have the option that you have to accommodate, and then you have folks who do have the option in terms from an office environment, but also dealing with many of those same safety issues to try to create an office work environment that individuals feel safe returning to. So yeah, it's a challenge all the way around. Emily, I think that leads us to our fourth polling question.
Thank you. Our final polling question: how would you characterize overall productivity change due to COVID-19? And your options are A, no change; B, an increase in productivity; C, a small decrease, less than 5%; D, medium decrease, more than 5% and less than 10%; or E, a large decrease, more than 10%. We'll give everyone a moment here, and once you have completed all CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. Give everyone just another moment here. All right, let's go ahead and see what everyone has to say. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So we're pretty evenly spread almost across the board here. No change, a decent amount, and we've got we're almost mid-20s here. Increase, small decrease, so lots of different experiences, and I think that that's kind of reflective of the marketplace. That depending on your workforce, depending on your type of services, depending on the projects that you have going on at the time, all of those and how folks are dealing with it is going to impact. And again, and if it was just one extreme or the other, that's actually probably easier to deal with when you have a whole different set of sort of experiences. That's okay. Then what do you do, and how do you respond to that? So let's talk a little bit about. So we talked about sort of the impacts of COVID-19. Then what do we do about it? How do we think differently? Do we think differently Do our goals and objectives change? So maybe some things for you to think about that others are. So your finances. So do you approach reserves differently now? Of course, no one's going to reserve for the extent of an economy being shut down, because it's not practical to reserve at that level. But might you take a different approach to your reserve levels moving forward, both as a result of this specifically in this event, secondly, as there is uncertainty still about whether how long this event, let's call it, is going to extend, or are we going to see it in the future, or just then third, just in general, might we take, I'll say, a more conservative approach to reserve levels as the learning for this. Same with variable costs. Might we rethink our cost structure? We'll just think of a simple example of it: compensation, salary, fixed costs, bonus, variable costs. Because of the economic impacts, do we think about how we manage our costs any differently moving forward than we did in the past? Policies, procedures, and processes. Okay, we're largely in a remote, and we saw the responses here, although they were across the board, largely in a remote working environment. Are our policies, procedures, processes all in place to accommodate that? I can tell you, I've never worked with an organization that all their policies and procedures were in place for the normal work environment. So are there things that we need to do to adjust to, again, this remote environment? And of course, that translates to technology and what I mentioned before. It's not just the communication use of technology, whether the various different video platforms, but it's the workflow process. And are there things that we're having to do differently? Are we using technology the best that we can to accommodate, in essence, a different operating environment? Our physical space, I imagine we're all thinking some about our physical space needs, and is our current amount of space, do we want that to change? Do we perhaps think we need less in the future or not? Might we need space in different locations due to the potential impact of suburban migration? Do we need to reconfigure the space that we have today for different work environment? All those things are considerations. Certainly in the construction industry, collaboration is paramount and usually a core element of your corporate culture and DNA. And that's one of the most difficult things to address in a remote work environment. You don't have that classic, you're in a room together with a whiteboard and you're able to, map stuff out and talk about that. That ability has been significantly hampered. And then, of course, just the relationships, that in-person interactivity and being able to maintain that connectivity within our organization. So all things that we need to be thinking about, how do we adjust to those? It doesn't mean we have to address them all or address them all in the same way, but hopefully we're thinking about all of those. Christian, additional thoughts?
Yeah, I'll say that, this is COVID specific. How do we ensure that we are basically providing that rock for our employees? Because amidst all this uncertainty that we've talked about so far in the presentation, and that everybody on this call, everybody everywhere is experiencing, you're looking for a bit of certainty. You're looking for a little bit of truth. And, that it actually kind of, you could turn it on its head and you could say, you know what, this might be an opportunity for your business, for your company to actually expand and develop your culture further, because people are thirsty. They are looking for that rock, that message, that where you're doubling down and really emphasizing what your purpose is, and they want to get behind it because they want to get behind something that will make them feel safer and more comfortable. So I think that's a factor to consider too, as you're looking to, this question about how will you adjust? What is your response to all of this? Is really understanding discussing within your senior leadership team, what is the message and how often, do I need to ensure I convey that message so that people will feel safe and that this is the rock.
So what a great and unrehearsed segue to talk about how more ideas that we'd like you to consider for how you're dealing with the impacts of COVID. So we chose to do it sort of through the lens of how you engage your employees. So exactly what Christian was just talking about, like this is an opportunity to engage with your employees more, and in doing that, being able to address the challenges that you're facing, the uncertainties that we all have. And so we're going to talk about impacting corporate culture through impacting or increasing employee engagement, which really has 4 primary components: how you plan, how you define and achieve performance, how you manage your people, and how you communicate. And we're going to sort of talk about 2 facets, in essence, to each of those. One is kind of things we would hope you're already thinking about and doing, sort of sans a COVID-19 environment, and then how you might be thinking about those things now differently because of COVID-19. And really just to sort of level set, you think of planning, you should have some form of a plan that's guiding what your organization is trying to accomplish. And that plan should be translated into specific performance you need to achieve to accomplish what's in that plan. You need to have the human resources necessary to achieve that performance, not just in employee count, but in the right types of employees with the right capabilities, and guided and incentivized in the right way. And then you have to do a solid job of communicating that there has to be this alignment between what we're planning to try to accomplish, what we're actually doing to accomplish it, and what your role or workforce is in doing that. And when you have those things in alignment and your workforce understands that, then they're truly engaged, and you will get much higher level engagement than 35% certainly. So again, each of these talk a little bit what maybe we'd hope you're already doing, and then how to think about it differently in COVID. So here's just a fairly standard strategic planning process. What I want to focus on is just 2 things. So on the front end of this, the left side, is really the inputs, the things that you would take into consideration as you're developing your strategic plan for your organization. So thinking about how are you incorporating participation from your employee base in that process, in that input process. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then how are you engaging your employees in the output of that planning process in terms of what you're actually trying to achieve. And here's an example of how you can translate a strategic plan, which we typically think of as a document that maybe goes on the shelf and you pull out every once in a while, is how about translating that strategic plan into a true management tool, where what this is representing, and of course you can't read it because this is an actual strategic plan, this is a full strategic plan for an organization, from mission in upper left corner down to quarterly action plans in the last 3 columns. And so just showing how you can, it doesn't have to be this big document, it can actually be something you can use really truly on a daily basis, although you're probably not thinking strategically in essence every single day or every minute every day, but you can use this as a management tool, meaning you can interact with your employee base relative to your strategic plan on an ongoing operational basis versus it being this event that takes place, results in a document that you reference every once in a while. So thinking about those, your employees, how you're planning, what are things that you can be doing then or should be thinking about relative to the impacts of COVID on your organization? So if you're not generally including your employees in a strategic planning process, or we'll just call it your planning process, annual planning, which you will undoubtedly be doing at some point while we're still in this COVID-impacted environment. What a great opportunity to do it. They're likely remote, using some kind of simple survey, even SurveyMonkey, to reach out to them to ask some questions relative to development of your strategic plan. What do they think your strengths? What do they think your weaknesses? Why do they stay here? What do they think your 3 greatest opportunities are? All sorts of things you can do that give you the benefit of gaining their insights and engaging them in the process. Thinking about market conditions, well, crazy market conditions right now, right? Uncertain, if ever, and how does that put into your planning, your strategies, and what contingencies are you thinking about where it maybe is a little bit more dynamic environment than it typically is. And in your case, in this audience, certainly how that impacts, if nothing else, your on-site work environment, and how are you preparing for how that might change. Your preferred future. So here's a really important one is many organizations think of, well, this is what we looked like in February or beginning of March before COVID-19 hit. Well, if we just think in the short term coming out of COVID-19, whatever that is, like getting back to normal, what do we want our new normal to look like? Do we want it to look exactly like it did in February? Are we just in the near term just trying to get back to that? Or would our version of what we looked like in February be somewhat different from what we've learned from this experience? So getting back to exactly what we had may not be our goal. And if it's not, what does that look like? I mentioned reserves, cash flow. How are we dealing with cash flow perhaps differently, knowing that we might have other ripples of COVID-19 or just this lesson learned? And then we've also talked about physical space. We really do need to think about our physical space now and how that might be different looking in the future than it is today. Over to you, Christian.
Yeah, with employee participation, I think it's important that in any kind of survey that goes out, I love the idea of a micro survey, right? It doesn't have to be huge. Actually, you don't want it to be huge because then it's less likely that employees are going to want to complete that. I also think it's key that there's a number of open response questions in the survey and that leaders in the company are reviewing or are reading through that raw feedback, right? Those qualitative issues that people bring up, or maybe the positives. It's key to understand what employees are really thinking, so then you can develop a plan around that. The other point I want to make around planning is that you could also think of it as managing culture intentionally, right? So in other words, leaders don't really manage culture, right? But we do manage the behaviors that shape it. So ask yourself, what behaviors are being encouraged? What behaviors are being discouraged? And then demonstrate the values and the norms you want to reinforce. This gets back to the original point about, are we really exhibiting these behaviors? But first you got to determine, what are the behaviors that you want? What are the behaviors that you don't want? Because it's the behaviors that you don't want. What are you discouraging people to act like? Those behaviors and letting them continue on, those really shape your culture in a negative way. So think about all these different aspects in the planning stage. Back to you, Mark.
Yep, thanks. And translating that directly into performance. So let's build right on that. What behaviors do you want? And so one of the ways that we gain greater engagement with our employee base, strengthen our corporate culture, is getting our employee base to think about performance at multiple levels. So regardless of what level they are in the organization, thinking about, there's the corporate performance, which we tend to all naturally think about, how's the company doing? There's the individual performance, if we have annual performance reviews, what's my performance? And then thinking about the team performance or department or whatever that sort of middle layer might be and how you define it in your organization. By getting people to understand that what I do has an impact on all three levels, and and I want to understand how I have an impact at all of those levels. And the better feel I have for that, the more engaged or committed I feel to that, the more I'm going to behave in the way that we as the company leadership needs them to be. But if they don't understand how they fit in, then they're just punching a clock, right? They're just going through the motions. And we want to help them understand why they want to do more, and then how does what they do translate into us actually achieving our goals? So defining performance at multiple levels in all different facets of the organization.
So I'll go through a few of these items.
Yeah.
And then I'll let Mark fill in any kind of holes. I want to focus on two of them. And one of them really is this use of technology, right? It's been so key in the performance, despite, people working from home, despite all of the challenges, right? It's allowed us to maintain connectedness. It's allowed us to at least be somewhat productive, if not more productive, right? Depending on who it is and what their role is. It includes this use of new communications tools, or I should say newer. Some companies did not know what Slack, Zoom, and Teams were before we entered this. And now I think everybody does. And most likely everybody's using it. Keep in mind, are we overusing it? Zoom fatigue is a real thing here, right? And too many video meetings can be a negative factor on your workplace performance, on your culture, right? But ask yourself, how are you best using this technology, right? Are you still communicating within the technology, right? Or via phone or however, are you still communicating a sense of common purpose, goals, trying to create community, doing the best that you can despite. And then I'll skip down to the last one here, because I think that this is so key, right, in maintaining and developing your culture. It's accountability, right? And I mentioned about behaviors and making sure that you're encouraging good behaviors and discouraging bad behaviors. And so this is where you really have to have the appropriate processes in place so that everybody understands what are the expectations of me and how can I track against those expectations. It can be easier to do this in person because there's just a lot of collaboration that I think that we take for granted. That's in person, right, when we're all in the same place. And when you're remote, now you have to try a little bit harder. So you have to put processes in place that really ensure that accountability is enforced here. Mark?
Excellent. And so I'm going to use that also as a segue just to focus on the people component of this. And this shows kind of just a typical sort of progression through an organization in terms of, moving up the hierarchy, but not so much to function on that, but to think about, okay, what are the competencies that are needed at each level of our organization, at each function across the organization? And the need to be able to define those competencies so that our employees can be accountable for developing themselves to be efficient and effective, productive in those roles, that we as employers can play our part in developing them against those competencies. And so, and the more competent they are in their roles, the better performance, the behavior that we're going to get that we want. And so, and then how do we do that in a remote environment? How do we deal with CPE, continuing professional education, development of those skill sets, where before we just convene people, do some training, review how a project went, doing a post-mortem, all those things. Of course, you can do them remotely, but they're probably not quite as effective. So how are we managing competency development in that regard? And talk about incentivizing behaviors, just to be planting seed, to be thinking about, okay, and then how are we, again, pre-COVID, aligning our compensation with the performance that we need from our employees. So this is introducing the multiple level component, thinking about incentive or bonus compensation, and maybe there are components of performance at each levels that contribute to what each individual might get. Maybe their largest portion might be where they can impact most. And then how does this change, if at all, in a COVID environment? One, just thinking about what has COVID, in terms of economic impact, had on our organizations, and what's it going to have on compensation, both in terms of it may have already had on salaries in terms of responding, or it may on bonuses depending on how you do throughout the end of the year. And so here's some other elements Christian's going to touch on relative to COVID impacts on people.
Two that I want to dive into in a little more detail. One having to do with empathy, right? All these concerns and stresses that we've mentioned, this is one of the areas that, you know, maybe we're not always the strongest at empathizing with our employees. We might want to be, right? Or maybe we don't want to be, but we may not think about it. But I think that's so important right now, right? Because there's just so much that people are going through, and therefore it's important that we really listen to them and what they're thinking about and how they're feeling, talking things out with them, avoiding being judgmental. So even if we cannot understand, we just allow them to feel this way, right? Also, this idea about creative and thoughtful engagement, right? We've got to find replacement activities for people to be able to get together the way in which they were before. You know, and I've got a few examples here. I've got a company that I've talked with, and they've been doing weekly water cooler times on a virtual basis with their teams, right, where they get together at the time that makes sense for that team. So a certain day of the week or a certain time, and then do the activity virtually that they all want to do. So some are doing happy hour, some are doing a coffee virtual chat, but the importance being that you're focused on the people and making sure that people are feeling engaged. Also this idea around socially distant socials. So how can we be responsible but still get together? And so ideas here, you know, golf, great socially distant activity, clay shooting, paddle boarding, kayaking. These are still things that maybe your teams will feel comfortable doing physically together, right? And can still bring people together to still feel a part of the culture as they did pre-COVID. Mark?
Great, thank you, Christian. So last area, or last sort of lens of dealing with increasing employee engagement, strengthening corporate culture, adjusting to a COVID environment, communication, and of course, might say more important than any other. So a couple thoughts here. One, and again, we're going to start with things that we would hope you're already thinking about doing pre-COVID, which is sharing your performance with the organization as a whole. So this really gets to, you know, transparency and trust and really understanding how we're doing. But in a COVID environment, much more so than ever because of all the uncertainty, our employee base wants to know how we're doing. Are we doing okay? Sharing that information, sharing the challenges, sharing the successes, but don't make them guess. Give them the power of information. And then thinking about, just as Christian was touching on, replacement mechanisms is hopefully you have a cadence to communication in your organization from leadership down, so that cascades and that you deal with various aspects of the organization from a communication standpoint, and thinking of your strategic plan as sort of a guide in terms of information to focus on. And so what are you doing to maintain that cadence during this? What are you doing to replace mechanisms that, you know, maybe it was all hands in persons meetings? How are you doing that today? But now more than ever, that communication is important, but also keep in mind what Christian mentioned is the fatigue part. There also can be the over video conferencing, over communicating. I think the biggest opportunity is filling in those information gaps that lead to uncertainty in terms of not knowing what's happening. And we can't know things that we don't know, but we can share that we don't know or share how we're planning to deal with them. Any final points there, Christian, on communication?
Yeah, I think too, of these items, recognition is just so key here. You really want to ensure that, like I said, you're recognizing those employees that are doing well. They might feel more recognized when you're all physically getting together, and when you're in a virtual environment, more distant. That recognition is not felt to the same level. So really make sure that you're thinking about ways to recognize employees. It's going to have to be a little different than how they're usually recognized. And I'll go back up for a sec to that third bullet point about increasing or improving managers' communication skills. There might be an education piece that's necessary here for managers to be able to communicate better. Or just different. Maybe they were great communicators before, but they're in person, right, is very different than doing it virtually. So this is both positive and critical communications. Do our managers, are they skilled properly to be able to communicate both styles as needed? Really ask yourself that and provide the resources for managers to improve those skills. Mark?
Excellent. And I think back to you, Emily. We're right at our hour time frame.
So we're just going to try to squeeze in one or two. Let me ask this one question. Do you have any examples of effective microsurveys and ideas of changes to make based upon the results?
Sure. Yeah. So we've actually done that recently here at Moss Adams. So we'd be happy to provide some example questions if you email us. But where we've done exactly what we talked about is getting a pulse of the organization and how it's feeling in this COVID environment. We actually did that, I think it was probably about a month ago, and then have been using that feedback to adjust some of the things we're doing from some of the operational standpoint. So yes, happy to share.
Great, thank you. All right, Emily, back to you.
Great, thanks, Elaine. And thank you, Christian and Mark, for a great presentation today. We are just about out of time. If you had a question that we didn't get to, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. You may also reach out to any of our presenters directly here if you have further questions. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next